Maggie Holloway slammed both hands on Wallace Hargrove's counter so hard the penny candy jars rattled. "My daughter is unconscious in the snow outside your door," she said. "And you're talking to me about a ledger?" Hargrove didn't move. Nobody in that store moved. That was the moment Cole Reed walked through the door, and the moment everything in Greystone, Montana changed. Not with a speech, not with a declaration. He walked past Maggie without a word, pushed through the door, stepped off the porch into the December cold, and picked up her 7-year-old daughter out of the snow with his bare hands. If this story already has your heart, subscribe to this channel right now, hit that notification bell, and follow Maggie's journey all the way to the end. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that December morning, 11 days into the worst blizzard Greystone, Montana had seen in a decade, and find out exactly how a widow with 2 hungry children and $11 to her name became the most dangerous person in the county. The winter of 1886 did not arrive in Greystone. It detonated. 40 degrees in 2 days, 16 inches of snow on the main road before the town finished stacking its firewood. The telegraph line went down on the 8th day. The creek froze solid on the 9th. By the 11th morning, Greystone was a locked box of 400 people with no way in and no way out. And the cold was the kind that didn't ask permission before it started taking things. Margaret Ann Holloway had already lost enough. She was 34 years old, 63 days a widow. She knew the exact count because she had marked every one of them in the dark before the children woke up, in the cold half of the bed where Daniel used to sleep, running the numbers in her head the way a field nurse runs triage. What's gone? What's left? What can still be saved? What was left? Caleb, her son, 11 years old, carrying weight no boy that age should know the shape of. Ellie, her daughter, 7 years old, made almost entirely of questions and will. The farm, 4 miles east, 40 acres Daniel had broken with his own hands over 6 years, currently mortgaged against a debt Maggie was increasingly certain had been falsified. And $11.30 in her coat pocket, which was every cent she had in the world. What couldn't wait? The flour barrel was down to its last 20 pounds. The smokehouse was nearly empty. For 2 weeks, she had been cutting her own portions at the table and telling the children she wasn't hungry. And Caleb had known for at least a week and hadn't said a word. Just quietly stopped taking the larger piece of anything. Just quietly passed the last of everything to his sister. And that silence, from an 11-year-old boy, cost Maggie more than she had language for. On the morning of December the 14th, she put on her good coat, the one she kept for town, and told the children to dress warm. "Where are we going?" Ellie asked. She was already pulling on her second pair of wool socks, the one she layered inside her boots because the left boot had worn through the inner lining. "Hargrove's." "Can we get the peppermint sticks?" Caleb looked at his mother. He already knew. "Not today, Bug." Ellie pulled the sock up carefully. "Is it because we don't have money, or because Mr. Hargrove doesn't like us?" Maggie stopped buttoning her coat. "What makes you say that?" "Last time we were in, he watched us the whole time." Ellie's voice was factual, unhurried, like we were going to take something. He watched Caleb especially. Caleb said nothing. He had gone very still, the way he did when something was true, and he didn't want to be the one to say it. "Mr. Hargrove watches everyone," Maggie said. "That's his way. Come on, the cold's getting worse." The walk into town took 40 minutes, through snow that came up past Ellie's knees in the drifted stretches. Caleb carried his sister on his back for the last quarter mile without being asked. Head down, boots punching through the frozen crust, not complaining, not even breathing hard enough to show how much it cost him. Maggie walked behind them and watched and felt the thing she always felt, watching Caleb carry what wasn't his to carry. Pride and grief braided so tight she couldn't find where one ended and the other began. She left the children on the porch of Hargrove's General Store. "Stay close to the wall," she told Caleb. "Out of the wind." "Yes, ma'am." She went inside. The store smelled like tobacco and lamp oil. Wallace Hargrove stood behind his counter, heavy-set and gray-bearded, with the permanent expression of a man who had made up his mind about people and found no reason to revisit his conclusions. He looked up when the bell rang. He looked back down almost immediately. "Mrs. Holloway." "Mr. Hargrove." Maggie placed both hands flat on the counter. Steady. The way she'd learned to stand in the field hospitals outside Chickamauga, where steadiness was the only medicine she had to give. 20 pounds of flour and 10 of cornmeal." "You got an account here." "I know I do." $14 outstanding." "I know that number, too." She set her coins and bills on the counter. $11.30. Every last piece of it. "That's what I have. I'll work the balance. I can take inventory, help with accounts. I kept my husband's books for 4 years, and I'm better with figures than most men in this county. And you know that, because Daniel's quarterly always came to you balanced to the penny." Hargrove looked at her money. He looked at her hands, the knuckles red from cold, the nails short and clean, the left hand still wearing Daniel's ring because she hadn't yet decided to stop. He set the paper down. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, not unkindly. "Just finished. I can't." "Mr. Hargrove, I'd be doing it for half the county if I started making exceptions." He pushed her coins back toward her. "I'm sorry. I truly am." Maggie did not pick up her money. She stood with her hands flat on the counter and made herself think instead of react. Because reaction cost energy she didn't have, and thinking was the only weapon she'd been able to keep loaded. She was calculating, working the angles, looking for the leverage point, when the bell above the door rang again. She didn't turn around. She was too close to something. "Something wrong in here?" The voice came from behind her, low and level, with a particular quality to the quiet of it. Not soft, not aggressive. Still. The kind of stillness that makes a room adjust around it, the way a current adjusts around a submerged rock. She turned. He was standing just inside the doorway, with snow on his coat shoulders and a hat held loosely in one hand. Tall, lean in the way that comes from hard use rather than good fortune. Dark canvas coat, collar turned up. A scar along the left side of his jaw, old and healed clean. His eyes were a pale, steady gray, the color of sky when a Montana winter is deciding exactly how serious it intends to be. He was looking at Hargrove. He had not looked at Maggie yet, but he had looked through the window at the porch, where Caleb and Ellie were visible through the fogged glass. And something in those gray eyes had already made a decision. "Nothing that concerns you, Reed," Hargrove said. "Private business." Reed let his gaze move to Maggie, then back through the window. Then he set his hat on a barrel of nails near the door and walked to the counter. "You got flour?" he said to Hargrove. "I got flour." He reached into his coat and set a silver dollar on the counter beside Maggie's money. 20 pounds and 10 of cornmeal. Put the difference against her account. He paused. "And the account balance." The silence that followed had weight to it. Maggie turned to face him fully. "I don't know you." "No, ma'am." "Then I don't want your money." Something moved across his face. Not amusement exactly, more like recognition. "Wasn't offering it to you. Hargrove can put it against the fence wire I'm here to pick up." He glanced at the storekeeper. "That work?" Hargrove picked up the silver dollar without a word and turned toward the back of the store. "Mr. Maggie said. "Reed. Cole Reed." "Mr. Reed." She kept her voice low and direct. "I appreciate what you're doing. I do. But I have been very careful about what I accept from people I don't know, because nothing in this county comes without a cost, and I cannot afford another cost right now." He looked at her, actually looked, not through her, not past her, the way men have been looking past her since Daniel died, at her. 20 pounds of flour, he said. 10 of cornmeal. No cost, no expectation. He paused. "Those your children on the porch?" "Yes." "How long since they ate a full meal?" Maggie said nothing. He nodded slowly, as though the silence had answered him completely. "Then let the man get the flour, Mrs. Holloway. Margaret Holloway." Something changed in his face. A small thing. The way a man's expression shifts when a name connects to something he already knows. He didn't say what it connected to. He just looked at her a moment longer and then said quietly, "Let the man get the flour, Mrs. Holloway." She would have pushed further. She was good at pushing. Had been, before Daniel died and the world narrowed to the point where knowing when to stop was the difference between surviving and not. But then she heard it. Ellie's cough, thin and dry, carrying through the glass. And every argument she'd been building dissolved. She took her money off the counter. Hargrove came back with the flour and the cornmeal. He counted out Maggie's $11 toward her. "Keep it," Reed said, "for the inconvenience." Flat, final. The voice of a man who said a thing once. Hargrove pocketed the change. Maggie picked up the flour. She was halfway to the door when it happened. Not dramatic, not the kind of thing you read about in novels. Just the particular silence that follows a child going down. And then her son's voice, cracked open at both edges, trying to stay inside a register it couldn't hold. "Ellie! Ellie, wake up! Ellie!" Maggie was through the door before she made the decision to move. The flour sack hit the porch boards. She dropped beside her daughter in the snow and pressed her hand to Ellie's forehead. Burning, not fever warm. Burning. The heat of a body that has run completely through its reserves and found nothing waiting on the other side. She had seen this. Not on a Montana porch. In the field hospitals outside Chickamauga. In men twice Ellie's size. Where shock and cold and not enough food combined in a body until that body simply stopped cooperating. She had held those men's hands. She was not going to hold her daughter's hand the same way. "She got real tired this morning," Caleb said. His voice was trying to be steady and not quite managing it. "She told me." "I should have said something, Mama. I should have told you." Caleb. Her voice came out exactly right. Calm. Clear. The voice that had talked men back from the edge in the dark. "Look at me. She's all right. I need you calm. Can you do that?" He nodded. His chin shook once and then locked still. 11 years old and trying to be iron, and she loved him so fiercely it was almost anger. Boots came down the steps beside her. Not Hargrove, who had appeared in the doorway with his arms crossed and the helpless expression of a man who had already decided this wasn't his problem. Cole Reed stepped off the porch in one movement, crouched beside Ellie, and pressed 2 fingers to the side of her neck. "Pulse is strong," he said. He looked at Maggie. "When did she last have water?" "This morning." "How much?" "Not enough." The words came out harder than she intended. He didn't respond to the sharpness. He simply lifted Ellie, carefully, correctly, the way someone lifts a person they don't want to hurt further. Head supported, arms positioned right, and stood up. "Hargrove," he said without turning around. "Water. Now." "Now, just a minute, Reed. You can't walk off with—" Cole turned and looked at Wallace Hargrove. He didn't say anything else. He just looked at him. And whatever was in that look made the storekeeper stop mid-word, as though the sentence had been physically removed from his mouth. "Glass of water," Cole said. "Please." Hargrove went inside. Caleb was on his feet. He was doing the thing Maggie had watched him do with every adult man who had appeared in their lives since October. The rapid, silent calculation of a boy deciding whether this person was safe, whether he needed to act, whether just this once something was being handled without him having to handle it. Cole glanced down at him. "You're Caleb." Caleb blinked. "How do you know my name?" "Your father talked about you. At the stockyard in Helena last spring." He shifted Ellie slightly, settling her weight more evenly. "Said you had a natural hand with horses." Caleb went absolutely still. The grief moved across his face. The grief he kept behind very careful walls, surfacing for just one unguarded second before he pulled it back. "You knew my pa?" "Some. Not well. But enough." Cole looked at him directly, man to boy, with no softening and no pity. He was a straight man. Said his son was straighter. Caleb swallowed hard and said nothing, but something in his shoulders changed. Hargrove came out with the water. Cole knelt, held the glass to Ellie's lips. "Slow," he said. "Don't drink it fast." Ellie's eyes opened. She looked up at the stranger holding her, took in his face, his coat, the careful way his hands were positioned, and did not cry. She studied him the way she studied everything she hadn't made up her mind about yet. "You have horses?" she asked. Caleb covered his face with his hand. 8, Cole said. "Why?" "Do they have names?" "The bay mare, Agnes. The rest don't yet." Ellie's expression shifted to something that, in an adult, would be called disapproval. "That's not right," she said. "How do they know you're talking to them if they don't have names?" Cole looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in his face. Brief, almost hidden. The expression of a man who has been a long time without being asked a question he actually wanted to answer. "Reckon they don't," he said. "Reckon I need some help with that." Ellie drank more water. She appeared to be considering his application. His wagon was a working man's outfit. No cushions, bed loaded with coiled wire and feed sacks, and a worn saddle blanket that had lived a full life. He helped Caleb up first, then offered Maggie his hand. She took it. Steady grip, impersonal and sure. She filed that away without meaning to. He put Ellie between them and clicked the team forward. He didn't ask questions. Maggie had braced for them. The inventory taking that men called concern. "How long have you been managing alone? What's the state of the land note? What are your prospects?" 4 different men had asked her versions of those questions since October, each one wrapping it in sympathy that evaporated the moment her answer wasn't what they wanted. Cole Reed drove in silence. He asked Caleb once about the fence line on the North Quarter. Straight question, practical, the kind that expected a real answer. Caleb, startled into responding as though his opinion had weight, gave a thorough accounting of every loose post from the road to the old pine stand. Cole listened, asked to follow up about the gate hardware. They talked about post holes and frozen ground and the specific problem of ice heave on corner braces. And Maggie watched her son's shoulders come down from where they'd been living since October. She didn't say anything. She kept her hands in her lap and thought about the letter from Victor Crane, the debt figure he had cited, the carbon copy she had found in Daniel's coat pocket the night she packed away his things, the original agreement in Daniel's handwriting, with a number that did not match Victor's number by exactly $430. $430. Not a rounding error, not a clerical mistake, a deliberate change. She had checked it 6 times. She kept arriving at the same answer. The farm came into view around the last bend. The house still standing, the relief of that still catching her off guard every time. The west roof section she was watching. The cracked porch step she'd been routing around for 3 weeks. The kitchen garden buried under snow, which was a mercy in its way. Cole pulled the wagon to a stop. Maggie was already climbing down before he could help, flour sack in her arms, Ellie on her hip. Caleb dropped from the other side. Cole stood at the back of the wagon and looked at the house the way she'd seen men look at problems they were involuntarily beginning to solve. "West roof's going before spring," he said. "I know." Porch steps cracked through. "I'm aware of the porch step, Mr. Reed. I've got roofing tar and shingles at my place, not using them." He didn't say it like an offer. He said it the way a man states a fact about existing resources. "And that step breaks all the way through. One of your children goes through it." Maggie looked at him steadily. The cold pressed down on everything. "Why are you doing this?" "Doing what?" "Any of it. You don't know us." He was quiet the way he'd been quiet in the store, not empty, just deliberate. "Knew your husband some," he said. "Knew him to be a straight man. And I saw 2 children on a porch in December." He picked up his hat from the seat and settled it on his head. "That's all of it." She held his gaze for a long moment. He let her look, without shifting, without filling the silence with anything easier. "All right," she said. He gathered his reins. "You need anything? Roof gets worse? Somebody in town gives you trouble? I'm at the Reed spread, 6 miles east on the county road. Anyone in Greystone can tell you how to find it." He was already turning the wagon when she said, "Mr. Reed." He stopped. Maggie squared her shoulders. The posture she'd carried since the war and never lost. Not pride, just refusal to fold. "You have work that needs doing. You come find me. Accounts, correspondence, whatever's piling up. I kept my husband's books 4 years. I can mend harness. I can cook for a crew. You need something I can provide. That's a fair trade. Not charity. Trade." He studied her for a moment. "Fair enough," he said. He drove away without looking back. Caleb came to stand beside her. Ellie had both arms around his neck, chin on his shoulder, watching the wagon shrink down the road. "Is he coming back?" Ellie asked. "I don't know, Bug." "I think he is." She said it with the absolute confidence of a 7-year-old who has decided something and sees no reason to revisit the decision. "He hasn't named his horses yet. He said I could help." Caleb said nothing, but he watched the wagon until it disappeared completely, and Maggie watched him watching it, and she recognized the thing on her son's face, because she felt the same thing happening quietly in her own chest, without her permission, and against every sensible instinct she had left. She turned toward the house, $11.30 in her pocket, 20 pounds of flour, a cracked porch step, a west roof section she was rationing prayers over, a land note with a number that had been changed by someone who thought no one would check it carefully enough, and somewhere in Helena, a man named Victor Crane, who had not come to Daniel's funeral, but was apparently very concerned about Daniel's children. She went inside. That night, after Caleb and Ellie were asleep, she sat at the kitchen table with Daniel's carbon copy and Victor's letter side by side under the lamp, and went through every discrepancy for the 7th time. There were 7 of them. She numbered them in her cleanest handwriting, the way she used to write lesson plans, clear, ordered, impossible to misread. The debt was false. She was certain of it now. What she didn't know was how to prove it to anyone with the authority to act on it before Victor Crane arrived in Greystone and made the question irrelevant. She was still at the table when she heard the sound at the gate. Hooves. One horse, slow, stopping just outside the fence line. Not coming in, just stopping. She blew out the lamp. She went to the window and looked out into the dark and the falling snow. Cole Reed sat on his horse at her gate, holding a lantern, not moving. Not riding in, just sitting there in the December cold like a man waiting to be invited or turned away, whichever she decided. She stood at the window for a long moment. Then she opened the door. "It's late," she said. "Yes, ma'am." He didn't move. Snow was collecting on his hat brim. "Heard you had a letter from a law office in Helena." She stiffened. "News travels fast." "In Greystone it does." A pause. "You all right?" The question was so simple and so direct that she was unprepared for it. She had been asked a great many questions in 63 days. No one had asked her that one and meant it. "I found something in Daniel's ledger," she said. "Something that matters." He dismounted. "Can I come in?" She stepped aside. He sat across the table from her, and she spread Daniel's carbon copy and Victor's letter open between them, and walked him through every discrepancy the way she'd walked through a field assessment. Methodical, no wasted words, conclusions supported by evidence. She showed him the number in Daniel's handwriting. She showed him the number in Victor's letter. She showed him all 7 points where the documentation didn't hold. Cole was quiet for a long time when she finished. He looked at the papers. Then he looked at her. "You show this to the sheriff?" "Sheriff Briggs told me the week after Daniel died that the railroad's legal arrangements were outside his jurisdiction." She met his eyes. He said, and I will quote exactly, "Mrs. Holloway, I suggest you find yourself a practical solution." Cole sat back. Something moved through his expression. Not surprise. Something older and colder than surprise. "I need a lawyer," Maggie said. "Someone who can look at this ledger, testify to the alteration, and file a counterclaim against the debt transfer before Victor gets a court date. I need it done fast." She paused. "I have $11. "I know a man," Cole said. "Samuel Birch, out of Billings. He's not cheap, and he's not fast, but he doesn't lose cases he believes in." "I can't pay a lawyer." "You offered me fair trade," Cole said. He reached inside his coat and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. A handwritten list, 2 columns, the handwriting blunt and careful and already familiar. He set it on the table. "I'm going to take you up on it." Maggie pulled the paper toward her and read it. Ranch accounts going back 5 months, unreconciled invoices, a cattle contract with a buyer in Miles City that had been sitting unanswered for 7 weeks, a promissory note from a neighboring ranch maturing in 9 days. She looked up. "This note matures in 9 days." "I know." "Do you have the funds?" A pause. "I can get them." "That's not an answer, Mr. Reed." She turned the paper over. "This is 3 weeks of work at minimum, at a rate that would cover 1 lawyer, filing fees, and an independent assessor for the ledger." She looked at him directly. "Why would you do this?" He held her gaze without flinching. "Your husband got my brother to a doctor after the Powder River trouble. My brother lived 2 more years because of it." A pause. "I owe a debt. This is how I'm paying it." Maggie was quiet. "That's a reason to help me once," she said. "Not to walk into a legal fight with a railroad investor who's been planning this since before Daniel was in the ground." "Maybe," Cole said. "But I'm walking in anyway." She looked at him for a long moment. At the man who had picked her daughter out of the snow, who had talked to her son about fences, who had ridden 6 miles in December dark and sat at her gate and waited for her to decide. She held out her hand. He shook it, one grip, firm and brief. "We start tomorrow," she said. "I'll bring the children." "Bring them." He stood. "I've got a spare room in the bunkhouse and a cook who makes decent biscuits. Henry can help with—" He stopped, looked at her, corrected himself without being asked. "Caleb can help with the morning work if he wants. And Ellie—" Something moved in his face, quiet and unguarded for just a second. "Ellie can come tell me what to name my horses." Maggie almost smiled. Almost. "I'll tell them tonight," she said. She walked him to the door. He was already down the porch steps when she said, "Mr. Reed?" He stopped. "Victor Crane has money and railroad connections and a lawyer who has done this before." Her voice was steady and clear and meant every word. "You understand what you're walking into." He turned halfway, those pale gray eyes steady in the dark. "I was a Pinkerton detective for 8 years, Mrs. Holloway, before I came here. A beat. I know exactly what I'm walking into." He left. She closed the door. She stood with her hand on the latch for a moment and let herself breathe. Then she went and woke Caleb. "Pack your kit," she said, "and Ellie's. We leave at sunrise." Caleb sat up immediately, the instant, complete wakefulness of a child who had spent too long waiting for bad things to arrive and had trained himself to be ready. "Where are we going?" "To work," Maggie said. It was the first time in 63 mornings that she had said those words and meant something other than survival. The Reed spread was 6 miles east on the county road, and Maggie had told herself the entire drive that she was not going to be impressed by it. She had built enough walls in 63 days to know how dangerous it was to let anything start to look like safety. She was impressed anyway. Not because it was grand, it wasn't. It was a working ranch, plain and functional, with a barn that needed a fresh coat of paint and a main house that had been built by someone who cared more about the foundation than the appearance. What impressed her was the order of it. The fences straight and tight. The woodpile stacked with the precision of a man who understood that winter was not a season to be careless about. The outbuildings solid and in good repair. It was a place built by someone who intended to stay, and who had thought carefully about what staying required. Cole's foreman, a barrel-chested man named Gerald Foss, who walked with a permanent list to the left from some old injury, met them at the gate with a handshake for Maggie that was brief and businesslike, and a separate, deliberate handshake for Caleb that treated him as a peer. Caleb stood 2 inches taller for the rest of the morning. Ellie looked at Gerald Foss for approximately 4 seconds and then said, "Where are the horses?" Gerald looked at Cole. Cole tilted his head toward the barn. Ellie was gone before anyone said another word. "She does that," Caleb said, in the tone of a boy who had been explaining his sister to people for 7 years and had developed an economy of words about it. "The spare room's in the bunkhouse," Cole told Maggie. "Clean and private. Gerald's men are in the far end. You won't be bothered." He paused. "My desk is in the main house. The accounts are under it. I'll warn you. It's bad." "How bad?" "I said I'd warn you. I didn't say I'd elaborate." Maggie looked at him. Something in his face was doing a careful, deliberate job of not showing that he was uncomfortable about what she was going to find. She had seen that expression on men's faces before, usually right before she opened a ledger and found out that "a little behind" meant 6 months of chaos. "Show me," she said. It was worse than bad. The box under Cole's desk contained 4 months of unreconciled invoices, 2 ledger pages that had been started and abandoned, a stack of correspondence from a cattle buyer in Miles City that stretched back to September, a water rights dispute with a neighboring ranch that had a response deadline Maggie calculated had already passed by 11 days, and a promissory note from a man named Douglas Holt that was not maturing in 9 days as Cole had told her. It had matured 3 days ago. She carried the box to the desk and sat down and did not say anything for a long moment. Cole stood in the doorway with his coffee and waited. "The Holt note," she said. "I know." "It matured on the 11th. "I know that." "That's 3 days ago." She looked at him. "Do you have the funds to cover it?" "I can get them." "Mr. Reed." She set the note on the desk between them. "I need you to understand something about how I work. I don't manage accounts for men who tell me what they think I want to hear instead of what's true. I did that for the county assessor's office for 1 year before I married Daniel, and I will not do it again. So I'm going to ask you one more time. Do you have $320 available right now, today, to cover this note?" Cole was quiet for a moment. The particular quiet of a man who was recalculating something. "I have 200, he said. "The other 120 is in a cattle payment I'm waiting on from Billings." "When does that payment arrive?" "Should have been last week." Maggie looked at the Miles City correspondence. She looked at the Billings payment notation in the abandoned ledger. She looked at Cole. "The Billings buyer isn't paying because you never confirmed the shipment weight," she said. "It's in the September letter, 3rd paragraph. He's been waiting on your confirmation for 11 weeks. The silence that followed was long enough to have a shape. "I may have set that aside," Cole said. "You set aside a letter that was holding up a $120 payment?" "I've been busy." "So I see." Maggie pulled the Miles City letters toward her and began sorting them by date. "Go talk to Douglas Holt today. Take him whatever you have and your word on the balance. Is your relationship with him solid?" "His son worked a cattle drive with me 2 years ago." "Then go. Take the 200, give him your word on the rest, and tell him you'll have the balance within the week. Because you will. Because I'm going to write to the Billings buyer this morning and resolve the confirmation problem today." She was already reaching for paper. "And while you're at Holt's place, ask him who handles his legal work in Billings." Cole stopped. "Why?" Maggie reached into her coat pocket and set Victor Crane's letter on the desk beside the ranch accounts. She smoothed it flat with her palm. "Because I need a lawyer who can review Daniel's ledger and file a counterclaim against the debt transfer before Victor Crane gets a court date. And I need to know who in this territory is honest enough to do it." Cole picked up the letter. He read it. The line of his jaw went hard and stayed there. $250, he said, for land worth 6 times that. Based on a debt that doesn't exist. He looked at the letter for another moment. Then he set it down and looked at her. "I'll ask Holt," he said, "and I'll send word to Samuel Birch in Billings today. He'll want to see the ledger." "I assumed you would." She was already writing. "Go. I'll have the Billings letter ready before you leave." He went. She wrote. And for the first time in 63 days, Maggie Holloway felt something that was not quite hope. Hope was too fragile a word for what she allowed herself. But something adjacent to it. The feeling of a situation that was still bad, but was no longer entirely out of her hands. She was deep in the Miles City correspondence when Ellie appeared in the doorway of the main house with hay in her hair and an expression of complete moral authority. "The gray one," Ellie said, "should be named Thomas, after Papa." Maggie looked up. "Did you ask Mr. Reed?" "He said I could name them." Ellie came in and stood beside the desk and looked at the papers with the evaluating expression she brought to most things. "What are you doing?" "Fixing Mr. Reed's accounts." "Are they bad?" "They're not good." Ellie nodded, unsurprised. "Caleb's helping Gerald with the water trough," she said. "Gerald said he works like a man twice his size." She paused, in the way she paused before she said something she'd been holding. "Mama, is the gray horse really going to be named Thomas?" Maggie set her pen down. Did you already tell the horse that? I might have. Then I think the horse's name is Thomas. Ellie considered this settled and left. Maggie sat alone in the quiet of Cole Reed's office with the accounts and the letters and Daniel's name hanging in the cold air of the room, and she pressed her hand flat on the desk for just a moment and breathed. And then she picked up her pen and went back to work. Victor Crane arrived in Greystone 4 days later. Maggie found out not from a letter and not from a rider, but from Ruth Kellaway, who ran the boarding house on Main Street, and appeared at the gate of the Reed spread on a gray Tuesday morning, with her coat buttoned wrong and her face carrying the expression of a woman delivering news she wished she didn't have. Maggie saw her from the window and was at the door before Ruth reached the porch. "He's here," Ruth said without preamble. "Came in on yesterday's stage. He's been at the Silver Star since last night, buying rounds and talking to anyone who'd sit still long enough to listen." Maggie felt the cold move through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Talking about what?" "About you." Ruth came inside without being asked and stood in the entryway and kept her voice low, though there was no one in the house but the two of them. "About this arrangement. He's letting people draw their own conclusions, which is worse than saying it plain. He's telling them you're out here because you had no choice, that you're dependent, that the children are in an uncertain situation, that he's the only one who's willing to step in and do right by Daniel's family." She stopped. Her jaw tightened. "I'm sorry, Maggie. I'm telling you what he's saying, not what I believe." "I know the difference," Maggie said. "What else?" "He's talked to Reverend Aldred." Ruth met her eyes. "Told him the children aren't in school, aren't in church, aren't being raised with any structure. Aldred is a decent man, but he's easy to work on when someone uses the right words." "And your Victor Crane knows every right word." She paused. "He also had dinner last night with a woman named Josephine Cray." Maggie went very still. "Judge Cray's wife?" "Yes." The room was quiet for a moment. Maggie stood with both hands at her sides and let the full weight of it land the way she had learned to let bad things land. Completely, all at once, so she could start calculating instead of just absorbing. Victor Crane had not come to negotiate. He had not come to go to court. He had come to make the court unnecessary, to build a verdict out of reputation and rumor, and 4 days of drinks at the Silver Star before she even knew he was in Greystone. "How long has he been here?" she asked. "Since Monday stage," Ruth said. 4 days. 4 days. While Maggie had been at the ranch, sorting Cole's accounts and writing to Billings and believing she had time, Victor Crane had been in her town for 4 days, poisoning every well she would need to drink from. She heard Cole's boots on the porch before he came in, the specific weight and pattern of his step that she had already, without meaning to, learned to identify. He came through the door, took one look at her face and then at Ruth, and said nothing, just waited. "We need to go to town," Maggie said. "When?" "Now." He didn't ask why. He picked up his hat. Ruth looked between them. "What are you going to do?" "He told a story about me," Maggie said. She was already buttoning her coat. "I'm going to go tell a different one." Cole drove. Ruth rode beside him on the bench. Maggie sat in the back with her hands folded and her mind working the way it had worked in the field hospitals. Triage, priority, what can be saved and in what order. Victor had talked to Reverend Aldred and to Josephine Cray. Those were the two that mattered. A minister's opinion moved through a small town like water through a cracked foundation. Slowly, thoroughly, into every room. And a judge's wife was not the same as the judge. But she was not nothing either. They came into Greystone's Main Street, and heads turned within 30 seconds. Maggie felt it. The quality of attention that had been shaped by 4 days of careful, expensive conversation. The looks that lasted a half second too long. the ones that glanced away too quickly. She lifted her chin and kept walking. The first person they encountered was Harold Finch, who ran the feed store and had bought hay from Cole for 5 years. He nodded at Cole, glanced at Maggie, looked away. Cole stopped. "Harold," he said. Finch stopped. "You know Mrs. Holloway," Cole said. "She taught your daughter reading the winter before last." Finch had the decency to look uncomfortable. "Clara May." He met Maggie's eyes briefly. "Mrs. Holloway?" "Mr. Finch." Maggie's voice was the nurse's voice, clear and unhurried, nothing flinching in it. "How's Clara doing? She was reading ahead of every child in the county last time I saw her." A pause. "She's good, helping her mother mostly." Something shifted in his face. The specific shift of a man remembering that he actually knew this person, that she had sat in his house and taught his child, that 4 days of a stranger's conversation did not outweigh 2 years of actual history. "You doing all right out there, Mrs. Holloway?" "Working hard," she said. "Same as always." They moved on. It went like that, person by person, the length of the street. Not confrontational, not defensive. Maggie stopped and spoke, and asked about children and crops and animals, with the particular warmth of a woman who had lived among these people and cared about them, and was not going to let a man from Helena erase 2 years of that with 4 days and free whiskey. Cole walked beside her and said almost nothing. He was there the way a fact is there, solid, undeniable, present in plain daylight with nothing to hide or explain. They were halfway to the church when Maggie stopped. A man was coming out of the hotel across the street. Well-dressed, dark coat despite the December cold. Silver hair, carefully arranged. The build of a man who had been substantial once, and had maintained the posture of it even as the substance softened. He saw Maggie at the same moment she saw him. He did not look away. He arranged his face into something warm and deliberate, and crossed the street toward them with his hands loose at his sides. Victor Crane. In the flesh, finally. Older than she'd imagined from the letter. More careful. There was a younger man with him, the lawyer, almost certainly, too neat in his movements and too watchful to be anything else, and behind them, hanging back slightly on the hotel porch, a woman in a traveling dress who shared enough of Daniel's jaw and Daniel's eyes that Maggie's stomach clenched before she understood why. Daniel's sister, Margaret, Meg, who had not come to the funeral, who had not written, who had not, in 63 days, sent a single word. Victor stopped at the precise conversational distance, not too close, not too far. Everything about him was calibrated. "Clara May," he said warmly, "I was hoping we'd run into each other. I had hoped for a private meeting, but—" He glanced at Cole with the expression of a man noting a piece of furniture. "This is as good a place as any." "Victor," Maggie said, "you're looking well." He nodded, sincere as a headstone. "The children are well?" "The children are fine." "Good." Another nod. "That's all I want, Clara May. For them to be well. For Daniel's children to have what Daniel would have wanted for them. Surely you can understand that." "I understand what you want," Maggie said. Her voice was level and clear and carrying, and the 6 people within earshot were all listening. "You want the land. You want the insurance trust. You want $250 to look like generosity when it's approximately a third of what you're going to gain from it." She held his eyes. "And you want to do it quickly, before I have enough time to show anyone the carbon copy of Daniel's original land note and ask them to compare that number to the one in your letter." Something moved behind Victor's eyes. The warmth didn't disappear. It was too practiced for that. But it became a different kind of warmth, the kind with edges. "That's a serious allegation," he said. "I have serious evidence." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Daniel's handwriting, Daniel's numbers, and a discrepancy of $430 that I have calculated 7 times and arrived at the same answer every time. She paused. I think you know the note is forged, Victor. I think you've known it since before Daniel was in the ground. Victor's lawyer put a hand on his arm. Victor did not move. Maggie looked past him at the woman still on the hotel porch. Meg, she said. Daniel's sister looked at her. The defensiveness on her face was complicated, not simple guilt, but the expression of someone who had been told a version of events they were beginning to doubt. I know you haven't seen Caleb and Ellie since Daniel died, Maggie said. Her voice was different now, quieter, more direct. I know you think you're helping, but the trust money Victor wants control of, it's not coming back out. That's Daniel's children's money. Daniel's. He worked for it. He paid into that policy for 6 years with his hands and his lungs. A pause. He loved you. You know he did. Don't do this to his kids. Meg looked at her shoes. Victor's jaw had gone tight beneath the practiced warmth. We'll see you in court, he said. Yes, Cole said. It was the first word he had spoken in the entire exchange. Quiet and flat and precise as a nail being set. Victor looked at him then. Actually looked at him. The first time since he'd crossed the street. Something moved in his expression. The recognition of an obstacle that was more substantial than he had anticipated. Yes, Cole said again. You will. Victor turned and walked back to the hotel. His lawyer followed. Meg was last. She looked at Maggie for a long moment, a complicated, private look, and then she looked away and followed her cousin inside. Cole said quietly beside Maggie, You all right? I saw what I needed to see, she said. What's that? Maggie turned toward the church. She doesn't know about the trust. He hasn't told her. And she's already starting to doubt him. She walked. If I can get to her before the hearing, Maggie, Cole fell into step beside her. Reverend Aldred first. She closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Opened them. Right, she said. One thing at a time. Reverend Aldred was a small, sincere man who sat across from Maggie in his church office with his hands folded and listened for 40 minutes while she did what she had always been best at, teaching. She showed him Daniel's carbon copy. She walked him through the numbers the way she'd walked Cole through them, step by step, without drama and without asking him to feel anything she hadn't given him reason to feel. She talked about Caleb and Ellie, about the lessons she'd been running in the evenings, about the questions Ellie asked that still sometimes caught Maggie off guard with how precise they were, about the way Caleb had started sleeping through the night again for the first time since October. She didn't ask Aldred for anything. She just told him what was true. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Mr. Crane came to see me, he said. He suggested the children were in an environment that lacked moral structure. I am employed by Mr. Reed as an account manager, Maggie said. My children live in a separate room. Every transaction between us is documented. There is nothing structureless about any of it. She held his gaze. Reverend, I would ask you respectfully to weigh what you know of me from 2 years against what a stranger told you over dinner, and decide which one you trust. Aldred looked at her. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood up and straightened his collar. Daniel Holloway was a member of this congregation, he said. His children deserve to have someone from this community present at any proceeding that concerns them. He paused. I'll be at the courthouse. She hadn't asked him for that. She hadn't dared. She found Cole waiting outside. Well, he said. He's coming. Cole reached up and adjusted the brim of his hat in the way she had already, in 4 days, learned to read. The gesture of a man covering a reaction he hadn't intended to show. They were walking back toward the hitching post when Maggie stopped. Meg Holloway was sitting on the bench outside the post office, alone. Her cousin was not with her. She was looking at her hands with the expression of a woman who had been convinced of something and was developing serious reservations. Maggie looked at Cole. "Go," he said. She crossed the street. She sat down beside Daniel's sister without asking. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The snow was falling again, quiet and steady, the way it had been falling for 11 days, as though it had decided Greystone was where it intended to stay. "He told me the children were being neglected," Meg said finally. Her voice was low and careful. "He told me you'd given up, that they needed proper family." "Did you believe him?" Meg's jaw worked.
"He's very persuasive." "I know." Maggie looked at her hands. "Meg, the insurance policy. Did Victor tell you about it?" Meg looked at her. In that look was the answer before she said it. $2,000, Maggie said, in Daniel's name. Payable to the children under the management of their legal guardian. Victor becomes trustee only if he has legal guardianship of Caleb and Ellie. She let that settle. "Did he mention that?" Meg was very still. "He didn't," Maggie said. Not a question. "No." The word came out flat and final. He did not. The snow fell between them. Somewhere down the street, a horse shifted at its post. Maggie waited, the way she had learned to wait at bedsides, letting people arrive at the truth at their own speed, because the truth arrived faster when you didn't push it. "If I testified," Meg said slowly, "if I told a judge that Victor hadn't disclosed the trust, that he'd framed this entire thing as a welfare matter when it was a financial one." She swallowed. "Would that help?" Maggie felt something shift in her chest, large and quiet. "Yes," she said, "it would help considerably." Meg looked at the street. She had Daniel's jaw, the same stubborn set to it that Maggie had loved in her husband for 6 years. "I should have come to the funeral," she said. Her voice cracked at the edge of it, the first real thing she'd shown. "I know I should have. Victor, told me to wait, that it would be better, and I listened, and I have regretted it every day since." Maggie was quiet for a moment. "You're here now," she said. "That counts." Meg straightened. When the Holloways decided something, Maggie had learned, they decided it completely. "Tell me when the hearing is," she said. "I'll be there." Maggie walked back across the street to where Cole was waiting. He read her face before she said a word. "Tom's sister," Maggie said. "She's going to testify." Cole stared at her. "How?" "I told her the truth." Maggie picked up her horse's reins. "Most people, when you tell them the truth directly and completely, will choose it. That's been my experience." She looked at him. "We need to get back and tell Birch." They rode back toward the ranch in the late afternoon, the snow thickening around them, the county road empty in both directions. For the first time since Victor Crane's letter had arrived, Maggie felt the situation shift. Not resolved, not safe, but shifted. The ground under her feet was different than it had been that morning, slightly more solid, slightly more hers. "Cole," she said. "Yeah? When this is over, when it's settled." She kept her eyes on the road. "I want to be clear about what happens then." He rode without answering for a moment. "All right." "I go back to the farm. We close out the accounts. We're square." She paused. "I need that to be clear between us. Because my children are starting to—" She stopped. Started again. "I need them to know what's permanent and what isn't. I need to know it myself." Cole was quiet for a long time. The snow fell. The horses moved through it steadily. "I understand that," he said finally. His voice was level and careful. "And I need you to know that I have never in my life offered a thing I intended to take back." She didn't answer that. She wasn't ready to answer that. But she rode the rest of the way home in the falling snow and thought about a man who had sat at her gate in the December dark and waited, without moving, to be invited or turned away. And she thought about the fact that he had sat there a very long time before she opened the door. Samuel Birch arrived 2 days later on a borrowed horse with a leather satchel that looked like it had survived a war and a face that suggested it had survived several. He was shorter than Maggie had expected, somewhere in his early 60s, with the careful, deliberate movements of a man who had learned that speed was the enemy of accuracy. He shook Maggie's hand before he shook Cole's, which told her something about him immediately. He sat at Cole's desk with Daniel's carbon copy and Victor's letter, and the 7 discrepancies Maggie had numbered in her cleanest handwriting. And he went through every page the way a surgeon goes through a wound, not looking for what he hoped to find, but for what was actually there. He asked precise questions. He made her walk through each discrepancy twice. He asked about the ink, the pen pressure, the numbering sequence, the specific way Daniel had written his 7s versus the way the altered entries wrote them. At the end of it, he set his pen down and looked at her over the top of his spectacles. "This is forged," he said, not a question. "I know. The question is whether I can get Judge Cray to appoint an independent document assessor before the hearing." He tapped his notepad. "Cray is not a corrupt man, but he has a weakness for established process. And Victor's lawyer, if it's Alderton from Helena, which I believe it is, will argue that there isn't sufficient time for an assessor and that the hearing should proceed on existing documentation. Can you fight that?" "I can fight anything," Birch said. "Whether I win it is a separate conversation." He paused. "But I want to tell you something, Mrs. Holloway, and I want you to hear it clearly. The forgery is not your strongest argument for the hearing." Maggie frowned. "What do you mean?" Birch leaned forward and folded his hands on the desk. "Victor Crane is not in that courtroom to recover a debt. He doesn't care about the money. $1,000 is nothing to a man with railroad investments." He looked at her steadily. "He is in that courtroom for one reason, the same reason he's been in that courtroom since before Daniel was in the ground." He reached into his satchel and laid a document on the desk between them. The life insurance policy. Maggie stared at the document. Official seal. Railroad Trust letterhead. "I know about the policy. $2,000, payable to the children under the guardian's management." "Did you know," Birch said carefully, "that Daniel added a rider to that policy 14 months ago, expanding the payout by $500 in the event of work-related illness?" He paused. "Consumption contracted from railroad dust qualifies under that rider." The room went very quiet. $2,500, Maggie said. $2,500, Birch confirmed. Managed by whoever holds legal guardianship of those children until Caleb reaches 21. That's 10 years of management authority over $2,500. Victor Crane is not a poor man, Mrs. Holloway. But he is a greedy one, and greedy men do not pass up 10 years of access to $2,500 when all it costs them is a few weeks of work and a forged number. Cole had come into the doorway without Maggie noticing. She looked at him. Something in his face had gone very still and very cold. "He knew about the rider," Cole said. It wasn't a question. "He helped Daniel file the paperwork," Birch said. "He's listed as the facilitating attorney on the policy extension, which means he knew about the rider before Daniel died, which means he may have known considerably more about the timeline of Daniel's illness Then he's indicated. He let that land. I'm not making that allegation in a courtroom without more evidence. But I'm telling you what the shape of this looks like to a man who's seen it before. Maggie stood up. She couldn't sit anymore. She went to the window and stood with her back to both men for a moment, her hands clasped behind her, and thought about Daniel in those last months. The cough that had started in spring. The way he'd pushed through it. The way he'd told her it was just the dust from clearing the north field. The way Victor Crane had appeared at the funeral, with his precise, expensive handwriting and his expression of measured concern. She turned around. What do I need to win? Birch looked at her with the expression of a man who had just revised his opinion of someone upward. 3 things, he said. First, the forgery challenge. Even if Cray doesn't appoint an assessor immediately, we put the challenge on record, which prevents Victor from using the debt as grounds for declaring you financially unfit. Second, we establish stable provision. Your employment, the children's housing, the documented nature of your arrangement here. He paused. Third is harder. Say it. Victor's lawyer is going to stand up in that courtroom and tell the judge that you are a woman alone, without land or reliable income, living on another man's charity. He is going to argue that the children would be better served by a blood relative with financial resources and established standing. Birch met her eyes. The best counter to that argument is not legal. It's human. Judges are people, Mrs. Holloway. They respond to what they see. If you walk into that courtroom looking like a woman who is struggling and uncertain and dependent, Judge Cray will struggle with his decision. If you walk in looking like a woman who knows exactly what she is doing and exactly why she is the right person to raise those children, his decision becomes considerably easier. You're asking me not to be afraid in public, Maggie said. Yes, Birch said simply. Maggie looked at him for a moment. I can do that. I know. He gathered his papers. Reed told me as much when he came to Billings. He glanced at Cole in the doorway. He said you'd walk into that courtroom and make Victor Crane feel like the smallest man in the room. He said his only concern was making sure the law backed you up when you did. Maggie did not look at Cole. She looked at her hands on the desk. The knuckles she'd stopped noticing were red, and she was quiet for a long moment. When is the hearing? Victor's lawyer filed this morning, Birch said. Judge Cray set the date. He looked at her steadily. Friday. Today is Tuesday. Yes. 3 days. Maggie did the calculation before she finished the sentence, the same way she'd calculated supplies and dosages and distances in the field. Quickly, completely, without the luxury of wishing the numbers were different. 3 days, with a blizzard moving in from the northwest that Gerald had been watching all morning. 3 days with Victor Crane buying rounds at the Silver Star, and Meg's testimony to prepare. And Alderton from Helena, who had done this before and would be ready for every argument Birch could make. She looked at Cole. He was already looking at her. We have work to do, she said. He nodded once. Tell me where to start. That evening, after Birch had retired to the bunkhouse and Gerald had taken the children to see about the horses, Maggie was sitting at the desk, going through her prepared answers to every question Alderton might ask, when she heard Caleb's voice from outside, low and careful, and then Cole's, and then a silence that had a specific quality to it, not empty, but taut. She went to the window. Caleb was standing by the corral fence in the cold, with his coat buttoned and his hands in his pockets, and the particular posture he got when he had decided to say something difficult and was making himself do it. Cole was leaning against the fence post a few feet away, not crowding him, giving him room the way you gave room to a horse that was deciding whether to trust you. She couldn't hear the words. She watched instead.
Caleb said something. Cole listened without moving. Caleb said something else, and this time his chin came up, the way it did when he was holding on to something with everything he had. Cole looked at the corral for a moment. Then he turned back to Caleb and said something quiet and direct, and Caleb's chin dropped and his shoulders dropped with it, and he put his face in his hands for just a moment. Not long, not dramatic, just a boy being 11 years old in the dark when he thought no one important was watching. Cole put his hand on Caleb's shoulder. He didn't say anything else. He just left it there. Maggie stepped back from the window. Later, when Caleb came inside for supper, his eyes were slightly red at the edges, and he was very composed about it, which was the Holloway way of grieving, thoroughly and privately, and then coming back to the table ready to eat. Maggie did not ask him. She passed him the biscuits, and he took two and passed them to Ellie without being asked, and that was how it went. Ellie had named all 8 horses by Thursday morning. She presented Cole with a complete list over breakfast, written out in her best handwriting on a piece of paper she had borrowed from Maggie's desk without asking, with brief justifications for each name that were entirely logical within Ellie's personal framework of logic. "The roan gelding is Chester," she said, "because he looks like he worries about things." Cole looked at the list. "I don't have a roan gelding." "You do now. Gerald says he came in with the last cattle drive and nobody claimed him." Ellie pointed at the name on the list. "Chester." Cole looked at Gerald across the table. Gerald took a very sudden interest in his coffee. "All right," Cole said. "Chester." Ellie sat back, satisfied. Under the table, Maggie heard Caleb let out a breath that was almost a laugh, and she looked at her son's face. And for just a moment, he was 11 years old and nothing else. And she was so grateful for it that it hurt. The storm hit Thursday afternoon. Gerald had been watching it come in from the northwest all morning, the sky going the particular heavy gray that old hands in Montana read the way others read words on a page. By 2 in the afternoon, the wind was up, and the temperature had dropped 15 degrees, and the snow was coming sideways across the yard, in sheets that made the barn disappear and reappear in intervals. Cole told Gerald to get the horses in. Gerald was already moving. Maggie kept working. She had one more night to prepare, and she intended to use it. She was at the desk, going through Birch's notes for the 3rd time, when the bunkhouse door opened, and Caleb came in, stamping snow off his boots, his face red from the cold. "Gerald says the north fence is down," he said. "The snow load broke 2 posts." "Does Cole know?" "He's already out there." Caleb stood in the doorway, dripping. "Mama, it's bad out. The temperature's dropping fast." "I know. Gerald says if it drops another 10 degrees before morning, the water line to the barn might freeze." He paused. "He says Mr. Reed has been out there an hour already." Maggie set down her pen. She looked at her son. "Is Gerald handling it?" "Gerald's got the horses. It's just Mr. Reed on the fence." She was on her feet before she made the decision, pulling on her coat, wrapping her scarf. "Stay with Ellie," she told Caleb. "Don't let her follow me outside." "She's asleep." "She won't be if she hears the door. Stay with her." The cold outside was the kind that didn't negotiate. Maggie put her head down and walked into it, following the fence line by memory and feel, the snow driving against her face hard enough to sting. She found Cole 30 yards out, working by lantern light, 2 broken posts in the snow beside him, and the 3rd he was trying to reset in ground that had frozen solid. "Go back inside," he said, without looking up. "You've been out here an hour." "I know how long I've been out here." She picked up the 2nd post and held it steady against the wire while he worked the frozen ground with the bar. The wind tried to take her hat. She held the post. He didn't tell her again to go inside. They worked in the dark and the driving snow for 40 minutes until both posts were set well enough to hold until morning. Cole straightened up and looked at the repair
and then at her, and she could see, even in the lantern light, that he was colder than he was admitting. "Come inside," she said. "In a minute." "Cole." She said his name the way she'd said men's names in the field hospitals when they were being stubborn about something that was going to hurt them, directly and without apology for the directness. "Come inside, now." He came inside. Maggie made coffee and set it in front of him at the table, and sat across from him, and let him warm up without talking, which was its own kind of conversation. The storm was loud against the walls. The lamp burned steady. From the back room, she could hear Ellie's breathing, slow and even, and Caleb's deliberate quiet, awake and listening, and pretending not to be. "What did Caleb say to you?" she said finally. "2 nights ago, by the corral." Cole wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. He was quiet for a moment. "He asked me if I was going to leave after the hearing." Maggie looked at her hands on the table. "He said every man who'd shown up since October had wanted something," Cole said. "And when they didn't get it, they left. He said he needed to know before he let Ellie get any more attached." A pause. His words, "before he let Ellie get more attached." "He's protecting his sister," Maggie said. "I know what he's doing." Cole set his cup down. "He's 11 years old, and he's been protecting his sister and his mother since October, and he wanted to know if he could stop for a while." He looked at her. That's what he was actually asking. Maggie said nothing for a long moment. The storm pressed against the walls, and the lamp burned, and she sat across the table from this man she had known for 11 days, and thought about all the careful, sensible walls she had built, and exactly how much good they were doing her. "What did you tell him?" she asked. "I told him I wasn't going anywhere." Cole held her gaze. "I told him I'd found a place worth staying, and I intended to stay in it." A beat. He said it was about time. Maggie looked at him. "He said that?" "He said he'd been waiting for me to say it since the second day." Something moved in Cole's face, warm and unguarded and entirely real. The expression of a man who had been genuinely surprised by a child in the best possible way. "He said I was taking considerable time." Maggie pressed her hand over her mouth for a moment and looked at the ceiling. When she looked back down, her eyes were steady, but the rest of her face had stopped being quite as careful. "He gets that from Daniel," she said. "Daniel never had any patience for people being slow about things that were already decided." "Smart man." "He was." She looked at her coffee. "He would have liked you." Cole was quiet. Outside, the storm said everything neither of them had said yet. Loud and relentless, and entirely without patience for delays. "The hearing's tomorrow," he said finally. "I know." "Birch says you're ready." "Birch says a lot of things." She looked at him. "Are you ready? Because Victor's lawyer is going to put you on the stand and try to make what you've done here look like something it isn't. Let him try." "I mean it, Cole. Alderton is good at finding the thing a person isn't comfortable defending and putting his whole weight on it." She held his gaze. "He's going to ask you why a man alone takes in a widow and her children. He's going to use every word that implies something ugly about the answer." Cole looked at her for a long moment. "I know what he's going to ask," he said, "and I know what my answer is." "What is it?" "That I saw 2 children on a porch in December," he said, "and a woman who was the most capable person in the county and had been given every reason to stop being capable and hadn't stopped." He paused. "And that any man who needed a reason beyond that to help them wasn't worth explaining it to anyway." Maggie looked at him across the table. The lamp burned between them. The storm said what it had to say, and she listened to it, and thought about Daniel, who had always known that love was a thing you built, day by day, with the people in front of you. And who would have told her, she was certain of it, that 11 days was long enough to know the shape of a person if you were paying attention. She had been paying attention. "Get some sleep," she said. "We leave at 7. He stood. He picked up his hat from the peg by the door. He was halfway out when she said, "Call." He stopped. She looked at him from across the room, steady and direct, with the nurse's posture and Daniel's ring still on her left hand, and 67 mornings of doing everything alone behind her eyes. "When this is over," she said, "when it's settled, I want to revisit that conversation about what happens next." He looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said, quiet and sure, the voice of a man who said a thing once and meant it every time. He went to the bunkhouse.
Maggie sat at the desk, alone in the lamplight, and did not go back to Birch's notes. She sat with her hands flat on the wood and breathed, and thought about tomorrow, and about the woman she needed to walk into that courtroom being. Not the widow, not the dependent, not the woman Victor Crane had been building a story about for a week. The woman who had held dying men's hands in the dark outside Chickamauga, and come back from that, and built a life, and buried a husband, and kept her children fed through 67 mornings of counting in the dark, and was still standing. She blew out the lamp. She was ready. Friday arrived the way hard days always did, without ceremony, without warning, just the ordinary gray light coming through the bunkhouse window, and the ordinary sounds of a ranch waking up, except that nothing about this morning was ordinary at all. The storm had broken some time before dawn. The world outside was buried and silent and very still, the kind of stillness that follows violence. The snow 2 feet deep in the yard, and the sky gone the pale, exhausted white of something that had said everything it had to say, and was resting now. Gerald had the horses fed before first light. Maggie heard him moving in the barn and lay in the dark for a moment with her hands flat on the blanket and counted her breath the way she had counted mornings, deliberately, one at a time, not letting the next one come before she was ready for it. 68 mornings. The last one before this was settled. She got up and dressed in the dark and came into the main house to find Birch already at the table with his papers, and Cole already at the stove with coffee, and neither of them saying anything, which was exactly the right response to a morning like this one. She poured her coffee and sat down, and went through her prepared answers one final time in her head, while the house came awake around her. Ellie appeared in the kitchen doorway, in her nightgown, with her hair loose and her stuffed rabbit under one arm. She looked at Maggie. She looked at the papers on the table. She looked at Cole at the stove. She processed all of this with the rapid, thorough evaluation that was her particular gift, and then said, "Is today the day we beat the bad man?" Birch made a sound into his coffee that might have been a laugh. "Today is the hearing," Maggie said. "Go put on your warmest dress." "The blue one or the gray one?" "The blue one." Ellie looked at her with the expression of a 7-year-old conducting a final assessment. "You look like you did before the hard days," she said. "When Papa was sick. You get real still." "I know, Bug. Blue dress. Go." Ellie went. Maggie looked at her coffee and did not say anything, because there was nothing to say to a 7-year-old who was correct. Caleb came in 5 minutes later, in his best shirt, with the collar buttoned all the way up, which he had done without being asked. He looked at his mother across the kitchen and said nothing. He sat down and ate his breakfast with a steadiness that was not natural to an 11-year-old boy, and that cost him something to maintain. And Maggie watched him, and felt the fierce, complicated love that had no adequate name. Pride and grief and gratitude, all pressing against the same walls at the same time.
"You don't have to come," she said. "I know." He looked at her with Daniel's eyes and something entirely his own. "I'm coming anyway." She didn't argue. The road in the Greystone was deep with snow, and the wagon moved slowly. Gerald driving, Cole beside him on the bench, Maggie in the back with Birch and the children. The cold was the clean, brutal cold that follows a storm. The air so clear and still that sounds carried further than they should. The creak of the wheels, the breath of the horses. Ellie asking Birch 3 consecutive questions about courtrooms that he answered with remarkable patience for a man who had a hearing in 40 minutes. Maggie sat with her hands folded and watched the county road go past and thought about what she needed to be when she walked through that courthouse door. Not the widow, not the woman who had $11 and a cracked porch step and 63 days of surviving. The nurse who had walked into field hospitals and held the room because the room needed holding. The school teacher who could reach the back row without raising her voice. The woman who had found 7 discrepancies in a forged document and numbered them in her cleanest handwriting and was ready to defend every single one of them. She could be that woman. She had always been that woman. She had just spent 2 months forgetting it. The Greystone Courthouse was a 1-story building on the north end of Main Street. And when Gerald pulled the wagon up outside, Maggie saw immediately that the room was going to be full. She could tell by the horses at the hitching posts. Too many for a regular Friday. Too many different brands for a coincidence. Greystone had come to see which version of events held up in the light. She climbed down from the wagon and stood in the snow and did not let herself feel what she felt about that. She just squared her shoulders and walked through the door. The room adjusted when she entered. She felt it. The collective intake of a crowd that had been waiting for the principal figure to arrive. She recognized faces. Harold Finch from the feed store, Ruth Kellaway from the boarding house, who had come despite the storm and was sitting in the 3rd row with her coat still buttoned and her chin set at an angle that meant she was prepared to have opinions. Reverend Aldred, near the back, with his hands folded and a nod for Maggie that carried more weight than most words. Victor Crane was already seated at the plaintiff's table. Immaculate. Dark suit, fresh collar, every inch of him arranged into the performance of a man motivated by family feeling and grave concern. His lawyer, Alderton, sat beside him with a stack of papers organized into a weapon and the precise, watchful stillness of a man who had done this many times and was not worried about doing it again. Meg Holloway sat 2 rows behind them. She looked at Maggie when she came in and did not look away, and in that look was a woman who had made a decision and intended to stand by it. Maggie sat at the defendant's table, with Birch on her left and Cole on her right. Caleb settled into the 1st row, directly behind her. Ellie sat beside him and folded her hands in her lap and was silent, which was the most disciplined thing she had done in 7 years of being alive. And Maggie noted it and filed it away in the part of herself that would think about it later, when there was room. Judge Cray came in. He was a narrow man in his 60s, with wire-rimmed spectacles and the measured, deliberate movements of a man who had learned patience from a long time of watching people behave badly and being required to respond to it with process rather than instinct. He sat. He looked at the room with the expression of a man who was aware that more people were present than usual, and had already formed a view about what that meant. "We are here on the petition of Victor Alderton Crane," he said, "regarding the guardianship of Caleb Daniel Holloway, age 11, and Elizabeth Ann Holloway, age 7, minor children of the late Daniel James Holloway." He looked at Alderton. "Petitioner's counsel." Alderton stood. He was good. Maggie had expected him to be good, and he was. Clean, measured.
every phrase chosen for the specific weight it would carry in a small-town courtroom. He laid out Victor's case with the confidence of a man building a wall, brick by brick. The debt, the land, the question of stable provision, the arrangement at the reed spread, and the implications he wrapped in language careful enough to be technically unprovable and plain enough that everyone in the room understood exactly what he was implying. He used words like uncertain circumstances and adequate provision and the children's best interests, and every phrase sounded reasonable while meaning something it wasn't. He called Victor to the stand. Victor was better than good. He sat in the witness chair with the settled authority of a man accustomed to being believed, and answered every question with the tone of deep and genuine concern. He spoke about Daniel, about family obligation, about the insurance policy, volunteering it before Alderton asked, with the transparent ease of a man who had nothing to hide and wanted the court to know it. Maggie watched Birch make a small, precise check mark on his notepad the moment Victor mentioned the policy. She felt the cold clarity of it move through her. Victor had just made the first mistake. He'd volunteered the trust before being asked, because he knew Birch had the policy documents, and he'd calculated that getting ahead of it would look like openness. But getting ahead of it on the stand meant that when Birch cross-examined him, the trust was already in evidence, and every question Birch asked about it would land in a room that was already listening. Birch stood. Maggie had watched Samuel Birch for 3 days. She had seen him read documents and draft arguments and think on his feet in the kitchen at the ranch, adjusting to new information with the practical speed of a man who had been doing this for 30 years. She had decided he was very good at those things. What she had not yet seen was Birch in a courtroom, and what she saw now was a different animal entirely. He moved to the front of the room with the unhurried ease of a man entirely comfortable in the space he occupied. "Mr. Crane," he said, "you mentioned the insurance policy in your testimony." "I did." Victor, still smooth, still composed. "The policy issued to Daniel Holloway through the Northern Pacific Railroad Trust in the amount of $2,500, payable to his minor children under the management of their legal guardian." Birch held up the document. "This policy?" "That's the policy, yes." "You are not currently the named trustee. The trust passes to the guardian upon guardianship being established. Which is the purpose of this?" "Yes or no, Mr. Crane? Are you currently the named trustee?" A pause. "No." "The current trustee is the children's legal guardian, Margaret Ann Holloway." Birch set the policy on the judge's table. "So, if this court grants you guardianship, you become trustee and manager of $2,500 held in those children's names." He paused. "Yes or no?" Victor's jaw tightened fractionally. "Yes." Birch moved on without comment. He moved on the way a man moves past a thing he has already placed exactly where he wanted it. He turned to the land note, and he laid Daniel's carbon copy on the judge's table beside the policy document, and walked Judge Cray through each of the 7 discrepancies, the way Maggie had walked him through them. Step by step, nothing dramatic, just the facts arranged in order and given room to be understood. "Your Honor," Birch said, "I am presenting the original land agreement as signed by Daniel Holloway in March of 1883. A carbon copy retained by Mr. Holloway in his personal records. I direct the court's attention to the debt figure on page 2. He turned to Victor. "Mr. Crane, you initiated the debt transfer that forms the basis of this petition. Is the figure in your transfer documentation accurate?" "The debt is legitimate." "Is the figure accurate?" Birch's voice was entirely pleasant. "The number. Is it the same number that appears in Daniel Holloway's original signed agreement?" Victor looked at the carbon copy. "There may be administrative adjustments over the life of. The original agreement shows $840. Your transfer documentation shows $1,270. Birch held up a second document. I am presenting an affidavit from William Greer of the Helena Records Office, 24 years in document authentication, who reviewed both documents and has concluded in writing that the figures in the transfer documentation were altered after the original agreement was completed. Different ink, different hand. He looked at Victor directly. Someone changed those numbers, Mr. Crane. The change benefits you by $430 and converts a manageable debt into one sufficient to trigger a land default. He paused. Can you explain that? The silence that followed had a particular density to it, the kind that comes when a room full of people all adjust their understanding of something at the same moment. Victor's composure did not break. Maggie had expected it to hold. He was too practiced for a single question to break it. But something behind his eyes shifted. A recalculation. The recognition that the room had moved. I cannot speak to administrative discrepancies in documentation. I did not personally. Thank you, Mr. Crane. Birch turned to the judge. Your Honor, I have no further questions for this witness at this time. I would like to call Meg Holloway. Victor's lawyer stood. Objection! Miss Holloway is not on the witness list filed with this court. Miss Holloway came to Greystone as a material witness to this proceeding, Birch said calmly. She has information directly relevant to the basis of the petition. I am prepared to argue relevance at length if counsel wishes, but I suspect that will cost everyone considerably more time than simply hearing what she has to say. Judge Cray looked at Alderton over his spectacles. Alderton sat down. Meg walked to the witness stand with the Holloway jaw set and the Holloway posture and the expression of a woman who had made up her mind and was done revising it. She looked at Maggie once before she sat, a private look, a look that said what it needed to say without words. And then she faced Birch. Miss Holloway, Birch said, you are Daniel Holloway's sister? I am. You came to Greystone at Victor Crane's request? Yes. What did he tell you was the purpose of this proceeding? Meg's hands were folded in her lap. Her voice was steady and clear. He told me Daniel's children were being neglected, that their mother was in a compromised situation, and that they needed stable family to step in. Did he mention the insurance trust? No. The word dropped into the room like a stone into still water. He did not mention that guardianship would give him authority over $2,500 held in Daniel's name. He did not mention that at all. Alderton was on his feet. Objection, Your Honor. The witness is characterizing. The witness is answering the question asked, Birch said pleasantly. Overruled, Cray said. Continue. Did he tell you about the land note? Birch asked. The debt transfer? He told me the legal matter was minor and administrative. Meg looked at Victor directly as she said it. He did not look back. Those were his words. So, when you agreed to support this petition, you were supporting it on the grounds of the children's welfare, not on the grounds of financial interest? Yes, that was my understanding of what I was supporting. And now that you are aware of the trust, the altered land note, and the document authentication findings, Birch paused, do you still support this petition? Meg was quiet for one long moment. She looked at Victor. She looked at Maggie. She looked at Caleb in the first row, sitting with his best shirt and his 11-year-old composure and his father's eyes. She looked at Ellie, who was looking back at her with the calm, clear attention of a child who was understanding more than the adults in the room had given her credit for. No, Meg said, I do not. The sound that moved through the courtroom was not quite noise. It was the collective exhale of a room that had been holding its breath without knowing it. Maggie felt Caleb's hand come through the railing and grip her shoulder. She reached up and covered it with hers without turning around. Victor stood. It was the first uncontrolled thing she had seen from him. Sudden, unplanned, his chair scraping back. Alderton grabbed his arm. Victor shook him off. For one moment, just one, the careful architecture of his performance was entirely gone, and what was under it was visible to everyone in the room. The cold, precise calculation of a man who had planned this for months and was watching it come apart on a Friday morning in a small-town courthouse in the middle of a Montana winter. "Mr. Crane," Judge Cray said quietly, "sit down." Victor sat. Cray took off his spectacles and cleaned them with his handkerchief, which Maggie had already learned in the last hour was what he did when he was buying himself a moment to think. He put them back on. He looked at the documents on his table. He looked at Victor. Then he looked at Maggie, and in that look she recognized something she had not expected to see from a judge. Not sympathy exactly, but the specific expression of a man who was about to do something he considered simply right. "I'm going to say several things," Cray said, "and then I am going to issue my ruling." The room went absolutely still. "This court has reviewed testimony and documentary evidence, indicating that a legal instrument was materially altered in a manner that falsely inflated a debt obligation and initiated an improper land transfer proceeding." He looked at Victor over his spectacles. "This court is referring the matter of the document alteration to the Montana Territory District Attorney for Criminal Investigation. Mr. Crane, I strongly advise you to consult with counsel before you leave this county." Victor's face had gone the gray color of old ash. "On the matter of guardianship," Cray continued, "this court finds that Margaret Ann Holloway has demonstrated stable provision, appropriate housing, documented employment, and consistent care of her minor children. The evidence presented supports no finding of neglect or inadequate provision. The petition for transfer of guardianship is accordingly denied." He picked up his pen. "The land note against the Holloway property is vacated, pending the criminal investigation, and a stay on any further collection or transfer attempts is in effect immediately." He looked at Maggie. "Mrs. Holloway, your land is yours." Maggie did not cry. She had promised herself she would not cry in that room, and she kept the promise, though it cost her something she would feel later when she had room to feel it. She breathed. She kept her hands flat on the table. She felt Birch put a brief, businesslike hand on her arm, and she nodded. Behind her, Caleb made a sound he immediately pressed his fist against, and did not entirely stop. Cole stood. He put on his hat and waited. He did not say anything. He had understood from the beginning that this morning was not about him. Victor left without speaking to anyone. Alderton gathered his papers with the efficient speed of a man mentally moving to the next case. The room began to breathe again, to shift, to fill with a particular noise of people who have witnessed something and are processing what it means. Meg stood at the edge of the room, with her hands clasped and the uncertain posture of a person who has done the right thing and is not sure what comes after it. Maggie went to her. "Come and meet them properly," Maggie said. "Caleb and Ellie. They should know their aunt." Meg's composure cracked then, fully, completely, in the way of someone who has been holding something for too long and has finally been given permission to set it down. "I should have come to the funeral," she said. "I know I should have come. He told me to wait, and I listened, and I have thought about it every day." "You're here now," Maggie said. "That counts." Outside the courthouse, Greystone's main street looked exactly as it always had. The horses at the hitching posts, the snow still thick on the rooftops, the cold pressing down without apology. But the people who came out behind Maggie stood differently than they had when she'd walked in. Harold Finch caught her eye and nodded with something in it that was more than acknowledgement. Ruth Kellaway appeared from somewhere in the crowd and took Maggie's hand in both of hers and squeezed it once and did not say a word and did not need to. Ellie was sitting on the courthouse steps, eating a biscuit she had apparently kept in her coat pocket through the entire proceeding. She looked up at her mother with her clear, untroubled eyes. "Did we win?" she asked. "Yes, Bug," Maggie said. "We won." Ellie considered this with appropriate gravity. "Can we go home now?" Maggie opened her mouth. She looked at Cole, who was standing a few feet away in the snow, watching her with a careful stillness she knew now meant he was waiting for something specific. She thought about the farm, the cracked porch step and the west roof section, and the 40 acres Daniel had broken with his own hands. She thought about 6 miles east on the county road, and 8 horses that now had names, and a desk that had become their desk, and a boy who had sat by a corral fence in the dark and asked a man if he was going to stay. She thought about what she had said the night before. "When this is over, I want to revisit that conversation about what happens next." "In a little while," she said. Caleb came down the steps and stood beside her. He had given up on hiding the evidence of his crying and wore it now, with the dignity of a boy who had decided it didn't need to be hidden. He looked at Cole. "She's going to argue about going back," he said, conversationally, to no one in particular. Cole looked at Maggie. "Is that right?" "Henry Thomas, Caleb James Holloway," Maggie said. "It's true," Caleb said, entirely unintimidated. "She does this thing where she decides something and then argues herself out of it because she thinks it's the sensible choice. She did it with the horses. She wanted to let Ellie name them from the first day." "I did not," Maggie said. "You absolutely did," Ellie said, through her biscuit. Cole looked at Maggie with something that was not quite a smile. Too quiet for a smile. Too warm for simple amusement. He reached up and adjusted the brim of his hat, the way she had learned to read. Then he said, "The ranch accounts still need quarterly filing before February. That's at least 3 more weeks." "I'm aware of the timeline," Maggie said. "And the west roof on your farm needs patching before the next storm." He held her gaze. "I've got the materials, and the time." She looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had sat at her gate in the December dark and waited, who had talked about fences with her son, who had held a lantern in the cold for a woman he didn't know yet, and called it nothing more than what it was, who had stood beside her in a courtroom this morning, without saying a word, because he understood that this was hers to win. 3 weeks, she said, at least. And the roof. And the roof. She looked at the sky, the clean, pale winter sky over Greystone, Montana, the storm gone and the cold steady, and the world under all that snow still there, still holding, exactly as it had been. She thought about 68 mornings counted in the dark, and the 69th that was coming, and how differently she was going to lie there in the morning and count it. "All right," she said. 3 weeks. Caleb made no effort to disguise his satisfaction. Ellie finished her biscuit and slid off the step and took Cole's hand without asking. The way she took things she had already decided were hers. And Cole looked down at her and did not pull away. "Chester needs his afternoon feed," Ellie said. "Gerald forgets the second scoop." "Gerald knows about the second scoop," Cole said. "Gerald thinks Chester doesn't notice. Chester notices everything." She pulled slightly on his hand. "We should go." Cole looked at Maggie. She looked back at him with the nurse's posture and Daniel's ring and 68 mornings behind her eyes, and something new beginning in the space ahead. And she thought that Daniel, who had always known what love was made of, would have recognized exactly what this was. "Let's go home," she said. 3 weeks became 4 before anyone acknowledged it out loud, and 4 became 6 before Maggie stopped counting. It happened the way most true things happened, not with an announcement, not with a decision that anyone sat down and made formally, but with the slow accumulation of ordinary days that quietly rearranged themselves into something permanent. The quarterly accounts got filed. The Billings cattle contract got renegotiated at a figure that made Cole's jaw tighten when Maggie showed him the number she'd gotten. Not with displeasure, but with the expression of a man realizing he had been significantly underpaid for 2 years, and that having someone in his corner who understood numbers was worth considerably more than he had calculated. The west roof on the Holloway farm got patched on a Tuesday in late January, when the temperature climbed enough to work outside. Cole and Gerald on the roof, and Caleb handing materials up, and Ellie supervising from the porch, with the authority of someone whose opinion had been neither solicited nor was going to be withheld. The cracked porch step got replaced the same afternoon. Cole pulled it out himself, assessed the rot underneath, cut a new board from the stack in the barn, and set it in place with the focused quiet of a man who fixed things because things needed fixing, and that was the end of the reasoning. Maggie stood in the doorway and watched him work and did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that the morning hadn't already said. Victor Crane was indicted in February. The Montana Territory District Attorney's investigation confirmed the document alteration, not just the land note, but 2 other agreements that bore Victor's professional seal, and that other parties, once they heard there was an investigation, came forward to question. The railroad, faced with the exposure of how its legal instruments had been managed, settled quietly and quickly, and paid restitution to Maggie in the amount of $1,270. The full inflated figure, not the original, because Birch had argued the original debt was also questionable and had the documentation to support it, and the railroad's lawyers had decided that a quiet settlement was considerably less expensive than a public trial. Birch sent word by rider. Maggie read the letter at Cole's desk. Their desk. On a Wednesday morning, with Ellie doing her letters at the far end of the table, and Caleb outside with Gerald, learning how to read a heifer's condition by the look of her coat. She read it twice, the way she always read important things, and then she folded it and put it in her apron pocket and sat quietly for a moment. "Mama," Ellie said, without looking up from her letters, "your face is doing the thing." "What thing?" "The thing where something happened, but you're deciding how to feel about it first." Ellie formed a careful E on her paper. "Is it good or bad?" "Good," Maggie said. "It's good." Ellie nodded, satisfied, and went back to her letters. Maggie went outside and found Cole at the corral fence, watching Gerald work a young horse on a long line in the snow. She stood beside him and pulled the letter out of her pocket and held it out without saying anything. He read it. He read it again. Then he folded it and handed it back to her and looked at the horse moving in circles in the cold and was quiet for a long moment. "What are you going to do with it?" he asked. "The children's account first," she said. "Separate, untouchable. Birch is drawing up the trust documents this week, so it's properly protected." She paused. "The rest goes toward the farm. The north fence needs replacing end to end, not just the posts we fixed. The barn roof needs work before next winter. And I want to pay the school in the next county for books. They advertised a surplus last fall, and I've been watching it." Cole looked at her. "Books. Caleb is reading 2 years ahead of where he should be. Ellie reads faster than I can keep up with her. They need more than what I have." She met his eyes. "I have been thinking about asking the county board about a schoolhouse." He was quiet for a moment, in the particular way that meant he was not dismissing what she'd said, but turning it over carefully. "There are 6 children on this side of the county road who aren't in school," he said. "Gerald's sister's 3, the Beaumont kids, the little one from the Holt place. I know. You'd need a building. I know that too." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not asking you to build it." "I know you're not asking." He turned back to the horse. "I'm saying I could."
The silence between them was the kind that had become familiar over 6 weeks. Not the silence of people who had nothing to say to each other, but the silence of people who had stopped needing to fill every moment with words, who had learned each other's rhythms well enough to be quiet together, without it meaning anything was wrong.
Maggie had not had that kind of silence with anyone since Daniel, and she had not expected to have it again, and the fact of it still caught her sometimes when she wasn't braced for it. "Cole," she said. "Yeah." She looked at her hands on the fence rail, the ring on her left hand. She had worn it for 6 years of marriage and 2 months of widowhood, and 6 weeks of something she was still finding the language for. "I need to ask you something." He turned to look at her. "That night," she said, "by the gate, before you came in, you sat there a long time." "I did." "How long were you going to wait?" He considered this with the seriousness he brought to things that deserved it. "As long as it took," he said. "You'd had enough people come through your gate who weren't worth opening it for. I figured the least I could do was make it your decision all the way through." Maggie looked at him for a long moment, at the scar along his jaw and the pale, steady eyes, and the hands that had fixed her son's boots in the dark and pulled her daughter out of December snow and set fence posts in a blizzard because the fence needed setting. At a man who had been a Pinkerton detective and had walked away from it because he'd watched the system fail someone who deserved better, who had come to Montana and built something solid and quiet and intended to last. "When Daniel died," she said, "I thought the hardest part was going to be the practical things, the money, the land, the farm. I thought if I could just hold those together, the rest would follow." She paused. "I was wrong. The hardest part was learning how to let someone stand next to me again." Cole was quiet. "I'm not all the way there yet," she said. "I want you to know that. I'm still learning it." "I know that," he said. "And I need it to be slow." "I know that too." She looked at him. "You're very patient for a man who fixes everything the moment he sees it needs fixing." Something moved in his face, warm and entirely real. "Some things take longer," he said. "That's not the same as not being worth it." She looked at the horse moving in the snow, Gerald's patient voice carrying across the cold. And she thought about Daniel, who had known from the beginning what love required of a person, and had never tried to shortcut any of it. She thought he would have understood this. She thought he would have been glad of it, in the way of a good man who wanted good things for the people he loved, even when he was no longer there to provide them himself. "All right," she said. That was all. But Cole nodded once, the way he nodded when something was settled, and they stood at the fence together in the cold and watched the horse find its rhythm, and the morning moved on around them the way mornings did. Meg stayed through March. She had intended to stay 2 weeks, and she stayed 8. And by the time she left, there was nothing uncertain between her and Maggie, and nothing reserved between her and the children. Caleb, who had inherited every ounce of the Holloway deliberateness, had taken 3 weeks to fully extend her his trust, and then had extended it completely, in the Holloway way, with no half measures and no revisiting. Ellie had accepted her on the 2nd day, and informed her on the 3rd that she was going to teach her how to properly assess a chicken's temperament, which Meg had apparently accepted as a reasonable use of her time. The morning Meg left, she and Maggie stood outside in the February cold, while Gerald loaded her trunk into the wagon for the stage, and they were quiet in the way of women who have said the important things over weeks of ordinary days and don't need to repeat them at the departure. "Write to me," Meg said. "I will." "And when things change—" Meg stopped, started again. "I want to be here for that, whatever that looks like. I want to be here." Maggie looked at her, at Daniel's jaw and Daniel's eyes,
And the woman who had missed a funeral and had spent 8 weeks doing everything in her power to make up for it. Not with grand gestures, but with the ordinary, sustained effort of someone who had decided to be present. "You'll be here," Maggie said. "I'll make sure of it." Meg hugged her, briefly and completely, and then stepped back and composed herself, and climbed into the wagon with the Holloway dignity intact. And Ellie called after her that Chester had requested she come back in spring because he responded well to her specifically. And Meg laughed, and that was how she left. The schoolhouse question went before the county board in late March.
Maggie presented it herself, drove the 40 miles to the county seat in a borrowed buggy with her proposal in her best handwriting and Birch's letter of professional support and a list of 9 children currently without access to formal education on the east side of the county road. She sat in front of 4 men who had varying degrees of interest in what she had to say, made her case clearly and completely, answered every question they asked, and waited. The board approved a partial funding commitment and assigned the land on the south end of Cole's property as the building site, which was either a bureaucratic coincidence or the work of someone who had made a well-placed conversation beforehand. When Maggie got home and told Cole, he adjusted the brim of his hat and said he hadn't the faintest idea how that particular parcel had come up. And she looked at him with the expression she had developed specifically for moments when he was being transparently unconvincing, and he went to get his tools. Gerald helped with the framing. Caleb was there every day after the morning work, handling lumber and holding boards, and growing visibly taller across the weeks of the build, in the way of boys who have found useful work and are thriving inside it. Ellie brought lunch every day at noon, with a punctuality that Gerald said was more reliable than his pocket watch, and she had opinions about the window placement that turned out to be correct. The east-facing windows caught the morning light in a way that made the room bright and warm through the coldest hours, and Maggie noted this and said nothing, because some things didn't require commentary. The schoolhouse was finished on a Wednesday in early April, the snow finally retreating to the high ground, the first green things beginning in the south-facing hollows. Cole hung the door himself, a solid plank door with iron hardware he'd ordered from Helena, the kind of door that said, "This building is permanent and means to stay that way." When he stepped back and looked at it, Maggie came and stood beside him in the doorway, and she looked at the room, the clean board, the rows of benches, the east windows full of April light, and she felt the distance between who she had been on that December morning with $11 in her pocket and who she was standing here now. And that distance felt both impossible and entirely ordinary, the way life does when it has finally arranged itself correctly. "It's good," Cole said. "Better than good," she said. He looked at her. She looked at him. And then she said the things she had been turning over since January, since the night he had told Caleb he wasn't going anywhere, since the morning after the hearing when she had said she wanted to revisit the conversation about what came next, and he had said, "All right," in the voice of a man who would wait as long as it took. "I've been thinking," she said. "I know. You don't know what I'm going to say." "I know you've been thinking," he said. "The rest, I'm waiting on." She looked at the schoolhouse, at the benches Caleb had helped sand smooth, at the chalk tray along the bottom of the board that Gerald had added without being asked, because he'd noticed she held chalk differently than a pointer and the standard placement was wrong, at the room that was hers, that she had built, that the county had sanctioned, that existed because she had made a case for it and people had listened. "Caleb gets asked," she said, "not told." Cole was very still. "I already asked him," he said. "Last week, out by the barn." Maggie turned to look at him. "What did you say?" "I said I intended to ask his mother to marry me, and I wanted to know what he thought about that." Cole held her gaze. "I told him it was his right to have a say in it, that his opinion mattered, and I meant that completely." "What did he say?" Something moved across Cole's face, the warm, unguarded expression of a man who has been surprised by a child in a way that stays with him. "He said he'd been expecting me to get around to it since January," he said.
He said it was taking considerable time, and he wasn't sure what I was waiting for. Maggie pressed her hand over her mouth for a moment. When she took it away, she was not quite smiling, but something close to it. Something that went all the way down. "He gets that from Daniel," she said. Daniel had no patience for people being slow about things they'd already decided. "I've noticed that runs in the family."
And Ellie? Ellie told me Chester would be very pleased, Cole said, and that she had been waiting for this specific conversation since the second day, and had decided not to say anything because she thought it would be rude to rush me. A pause. She also said she would need a yellow dress for the occasion, if there was going to be one. Maggie laughed. It came up from somewhere deep and unguarded, and took her completely. The kind of laugh that didn't leave room for anything careful. The kind she had not had since before Daniel got sick, and the world started narrowing. She laughed, and felt the last of the walls come down. Not with a crash, not dramatically, just quietly and completely. The way things settle when they are finally in the right place. Cole reached out and took her hands, both of them, the steady grip that had been impersonal on a December morning, and was something else entirely now. She looked up at him. "Margaret Ann Holloway," he said. "Will you stay?" She looked at this man who had fixed her son's boots in the dark, who had driven 4 miles through December cold to return a widow and her children to a farm he had no obligation to care about, who had stood beside her on a public street and said nothing because he understood that some fights needed to be hers, who had sat at her gate in the dark and waited, for as long as it took, as long as she needed, entirely at her decision. She thought about Daniel, about what Daniel would say, what Daniel had always said, that love was a thing you built day by day with the work in your hands and the people in front of you. That it wasn't a feeling that arrived complete, but a choice you made in the ordinary moments, over and over, until the ordinary moments became a life. She had been making that choice for 6 weeks without naming it. She supposed it was time to name it. "Yes," she said. "We'll stay." He held her hands, and she let him hold them, and April came through the open schoolhouse door around them, warm and new, and entirely without apology for being what it was. The wedding was in May, before the spring planting, in the church where Reverend Aldred had watched everything unfold and had shown up anyway. Ruth Kellaway brought 2 pies and cried openly and did not apologize for it. Gerald wore his best hat and stood so straight during the ceremony that Caleb whispered to Ellie that Gerald looked like he might be trying to see over something. Meg came from Helena and arrived the day before and spent the evening sitting at the kitchen table with Maggie, talking about Daniel. Really talking, the way they hadn't been able to before, because before there had been too much grief and too much guilt sitting between them. By the time they went to bed, the table between them was clear. Caleb stood at his mother's side during the ceremony, with the solemn, complete attention of a boy who understood exactly what he was witnessing, and had decided it was exactly right. When Reverend Aldred asked who gave this woman, Caleb said, "I do," with a steadiness that made Ruth cry harder and made Cole look at him with the expression of a man who had been given something he hadn't known he was missing. Ellie wore yellow. She had been specific about this from the moment the occasion was confirmed, and no one had argued with her, because arguing with Ellie about things she had already decided was a reliable way to lose. After the ceremony, when the small crowd had gathered outside the church in the May sunshine, and the pies were being distributed, and Gerald was telling someone a story that involved considerable arm movement, Maggie found a moment alone with Cole on the church steps. Not a long moment. Ellie was already approaching with a piece of pie and a proprietary expression, but a moment. "How do you feel?" Cole asked. Maggie considered the question. She thought about $11.30 and a cracked porch step and 68 mornings counted in the dark. She thought about a silver dollar on a general store counter and a man who had picked her daughter out of December snow without being asked.
She thought about a courtroom in winter, and 7 discrepancies numbered in her cleanest handwriting, and a judge who had looked at her and said, "Your land is yours." She thought about a schoolhouse with east-facing windows and a solid plank door and benches that her son had helped sand smooth. She thought about the shape of a life that had been taken apart and rebuilt into something she had not planned for and could not have imagined in November, and would not now trade for anything she had known before. "Like someone who did the work," she said.
Cole looked at her. "Yeah," he said. "You did." Ellie arrived with the pie and inserted herself between them with the confidence of a child who had never once doubted that she belonged exactly where she was. And Caleb came around the other side and stood close in the way he had lately, not needing anything, just present, just there. And the 4 of them stood in the May sunshine outside a church in Greystone, Montana, and the world moved around them in its ordinary way, bright and cold, and entirely, completely theirs. That summer, Maggie taught 9 children in the schoolhouse Cole had built. The summer after, 14. By the fall of 1888, she had written to the county board for a second time and proposed a permanent teaching position and a salary. And the county board, by then accustomed to receiving proposals from Margaret Reed that were clear and reasonable and supported by evidence they could not argue with, had agreed. On the morning they hung the new sign above the schoolhouse door, Greystone East County School, lettered by Caleb in his best hand, with a steadiness that no longer surprised anyone. Maggie stood in the doorway of the room and looked at what she had built out of what had been taken, and thought about all the distances. The distance between $11 and a paid county salary. The distance between a cracked porch step and a solid plank door. The distance between 68 mornings counted alone in the dark, and the morning she had just had, which she had counted too, because she had never stopped counting, but which she had counted differently, not as survival, but as gratitude. Cole came up behind her. He put his hand on the back of her shoulder the way he did, not possessive, just present, just steady, the way he had been from a gate in the December dark. "Well," he said. She looked at the room. The light came through the east windows the way Ellie had known it would. Caleb's lettering was straight and clean above the door. Outside, she could hear Ellie explaining something to Chester at considerable length, which was how most mornings began, and Gerald's patient answer, and the sound of this piece of Montana going about the ordinary business of a day. "We did good work," she said. Cole looked at the sign his son had lettered, at the room his wife had built, at the school that existed because a woman had walked into a general store in December with 63 days of grief and $11 and the absolute refusal to stop. "Yeah," he said, "we did." Margaret Ann Reed stood in the doorway of the school she had built in the county that had tried to take everything from her, in the life she had constructed from the wreckage of the one before it, in the morning that was hers. And she was paying attention to every last piece of it. She always had been. She always would be.